All right, thank you, everybody. So for our next panel, I'd like to introduce Kennedy. Kennedy is with Greenlight Guru, who makes an electronic quality management software and EDC platform specifically designed for the medtech industry. Greenlight Guru has been a partner sponsor of this event since the beginning. So thank you again for being here. We're super excited to have this panel, and always grateful for the support that Greenlight provides this event in the medtech community. They're right outside in the sponsor booth area. So if you haven't gotten a chance to meet them, talk to them. They're fantastic, and they have a great team here. This panel is going to be one to remember. I love a ton of the founders on it, and I'm super excited that we were able to pull them all together. So Kennedy, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Henry. Thank LSI as well so much. This has been an incredible couple days of networking, education, inspiration, and I have a feeling that this session is going to be no different. So this session, I'm excited about it because typically at an event like this, we might be hearing from strategics or investors, and we now have an opportunity to hear from the innovators in the space, and specifically some early stage CEOs, first time CEOs that have some incredible stories and are bringing together some of the most incredible medtech products that the industry's ever seen. So I'd love to hear first a little bit about each of you, your journey, background. We'll keep it brief, and then we'll dive more into it as we get to questions. So Tim, let's start with you.
Cool, sounds good. Hey everybody, Tim Fitzpatrick, co-founder and CEO at IKONA Health. IKONA is a VR learning platform for patients with kidney disease. Our first market is dialysis, helping patients transition to at-home care. About the journey, kind of how I got here quickly. Great. So I'm a patient. I'm still a patient, but I was discharged from the Navy about 8 years ago from while I was down in Florida. My last 2 years in the service were in the hospital, so I went through the ringer with treatment, wound care, pain, isolation, still a VA patient. Eventually ended up meeting my co-founders, two physicians who had this really interesting research around VR in the perioperative setting. Fascinatingly, one of the guys was a VR filmmaker prior to med school, so we had this cool idea that we might codify storytelling someday, and that's what we've been working on. So we launched in early 2017. We, within 12 months, found kidney care, and some great colleagues here in the audience who helped us find that and discover that as a market, and now we're building a learning solution, a learning science company to address a massive need in the chronic care space.
Thank you.
Over to me, okay. My name is Cody Simmons. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DermaSensor. We've developed a point-and-click skin cancer detection device specifically for use by primary care providers. And our kind of main goal or thesis is that dermatologists are already quite adept at evaluating skin. But there's hundreds of thousands of frontline providers like family doctors, internists, NPs and PAs at CVS Minute clinics that are currently or could be asked about suspicious lesions, and we could kind of upskill their ability to evaluate those and correctly refer them. So that's really what we're focused on to really improve access to effective skin cancer evaluations, and that's about the journey. My background's in bioengineering and business, and after several years at Genentech and then a very similar mobile device screen and monitoring startup, was connected with my co-founders who are very, very successful medical device entrepreneurs and executives. Maurice is the co-founder of Mako Surgical, which sold to Stryker for a couple billion, and currently Insight Tech, and Fred Mull's kind of part of that group, which I imagine a few of you know. And my mom was a melanoma survivor. I had my first biopsy when I was 15, growing up playing tennis. So oncology, through all the work at Genentech, and skin cancer in particular, was a big passion of mine. And we started off, as Maurice put it, they had an interesting research project that they were looking for someone to turn into a company. And so we had a 30-pound microwave size spectrometer, and they're like, yeah, we just got to get that down to like a 1 pound light pen, and she'll only take you a year. And 4 years later, got the device done, and we're now 6 clinical studies and 7 years in, and currently pending FDA review, and so hopefully it'll be available soon to providers near you.
So I was actually almost 30 before I figured out I was an entrepreneur. I, from the young age, I started a babysitting business at 13. I was doing all these different things, but I always saw it as a means to an end. There was a problem I wanted to solve, and so if somebody else wasn't solving it, then I'll go solve it. And I thought of entrepreneurs as kind of the used car salesman. It was not even on my radar. And what really changed for me is I started working in looking at how the brain processes language and how stroke aphasia patients were impacted differently in their second language versus their first language. And as I moved from starting off in the nonprofit sector to moving into for-profit, I thought med device was just kind of a transition point, and I completely loved it. And I was working with some of the world's largest contract manufacturers, I was working with strategics, I was working with startups, and I really saw this need for the expertise that you can get at a global 200,000 person company like we were, but in a package that was really accessible to startups. And so I was consulting and I was working on these projects on the side, and I really got to see the startup journey from the inside, from the behind the scenes view. And so took that product expertise that I developed and really started looking at which of the problems made sense to solve. I will say by the time my co-founder and we had gone through 6 different iterations of different things where we said, what about this problem? Or a doctor would come to us and say, somebody should solve that. And so we really were the first to do diligence on ourselves. We would look at what's the problem? What's the market? Is there really an opportunity here? And is the solution something we can bring to market in the time frame you can actually get funded, right? So I mean, one of the big questions is there's some really cool problems, but if it's going to take 20 years and it's probably not going to get funded, I really wanted something I could do. And so this one, we actually had the consultancy going well. And so when my co-founder said, okay, I think this one's it, I said, no, I'm finally fully inbound. We're in a good place. I'm not going to blow up this business. And he was like, no, this one. I said, okay. 90-day benchtop study, even though it's only used for 7 days. I was like, we're going to set this bar nice and high. And when it performed flawlessly, and I talked with nurses, and they were like, this is a real problem. And I talked with patients, and they said that would completely transform care. And I talked with the neurosurgeon or intensivist, and the consistent message was, why hasn't somebody done this yet? I said, okay, we got to do this one. And so we jumped in January of 2021.
So I'm not sure how to compress my story too much, but I mean, I'm a mechanical engineer. It's really interesting actually to hear you say it's kind of not a means to an end, because I honestly think about it exactly the opposite way. Because the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is because there is this vision of the world that I feel like I and my co-founders share, that we believe in and we want to make happen and make real. And that's the whole goal, right? That's why we're here. Absolutely. And we're doing it through, and it's not, I'm not, by the way, trying to say it's right or right, it's just different, like it's very different personally for me. So anyway, I started this company like about 10 years ago. We're a surgical robotics company. We're almost there in the sense that we are almost in the clinic at this point. We'll be there sometime early next year. And out to FDA authorization and commercialization after that.
I won't comment on either means to an end or not. I think both are good arguments, not to be the sort of middle ground person here. But, for me, the journey, I think sort of similar to what's been said is I had asthma as a kid. I went to the hospital for it often. And I always remembered being asked by my doctor, when did you start wheezing, coughing, and having shortness of breath? And just thinking it was a fascinating question, because who really knows the answer to that, right? Questionnaires don't really, give that nuanced detail of important information back to clinicians, and yet that's sort of standard of care. And so my professional background was in healthcare advisory, so I was working with hospital systems, and sort of saw the change in value-based payment models, and was trying to help hospital systems think about their populations of chronic disease patients, and okay, how do you avoid hospitalizations and high costs of care. And for me, I ended up going to an event while I was in graduate school getting an MBA, pitched this problem on stage at a hackathon at a hospital system, met a clinician who said, hey, I've actually worked on the idea of acoustic monitoring for patients with pulmonary disease, and there's a ton of data that dates back for 50 years that, yes, there are signatures in wheezing that you can identify from a stethoscope, right? But there's never been a product that's actually been developed to manage a patient getting that data back to a clinician to try to drive outcomes. So we said, well, okay, let's do that. and see what happens. Talked to a lot of patients, talked to a lot of clinicians, did some business competitions really early on, said, hey, there's a real there, and then started raising money. But yeah, my background is not clinical or engineering, but I think to your point, right, the patient journey, I think, is a really essential component so that you have that North Star. You know where you want to go, you know why you want to get there, and then the technology pieces hopefully will fall into place properly. So that's a bit of my background.
Thank you all so much for sharing. You know, I know that you've all encountered a ton of challenges, some that are really unique because you are first-time founders and CEOs. And I'm curious whether it's from a fundraising perspective, building your company, or building your team, how you've navigated through those challenges, maybe what the biggest one is, what that story looked like. Adam, I know you have a unique fundraising story background, if you'd want to share a little bit more about what that's looked like.
Yeah, well, it's definitely been an adventure. I don't think fundraising is, maybe getting the first money is one of the biggest challenges. I think after that, you actually start to prove out what you're doing and prove out the value of what you're doing. And, in general, maybe short of like this market right now, it becomes easier and easier. I'd actually say that the biggest challenge is the people. It's also the best thing about, running a company. But I mean, we're 200 and something people, and there's always some challenge within the team, and being able to make sure that the entire team is aligned, rowing in the same direction, right, and moving as quickly as humanly possible is not an easy feat, and it only gets harder and harder as the company gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah, thank you. Any parallels in your guys' story? Seeing the same thing, the same people being a challenge?
So we're a 5-person company, so good to know more challenges ahead. I think being in the very early stages, the people problem looks a little bit different. So the reality is most people have never heard of us, right? So when it comes to recruiting, it's not how do you decide which person to hire, it's how do you get people of the right caliber to even be applying for every one of those positions. It's, okay, yes, as the teams get larger, you have to figure out the team dynamic. At our case, it's how many hats can one person wear and how do we avoid drowning them in the process, right? But I think as a first-time founder who had a lot of experience on product, but not a lot of experience in the startup community. So for me, we were preparing to launch our company during COVID, which actually personally turned out to be a great thing because all of these investors and later stage people who were bored at home started, they were hosting Clubhouse spaces, and they were hosting Twitter events, and they were hosting webinars, and we had some neurosurgeons who weren't the best at technology posting Zoom links on the Twitter feed, and so I got to sit on the wall, fly on the wall for a number of activities that I would have otherwise not had the budget to go flying all over the country to be a part of. So actually, everyone being stuck at home was a great opportunity for me to get to learn the business. So yes, I read venture deals, but the reason I even knew to read venture deals was because it was getting talked about on LinkedIn and Twitter. So really having that opportunity to figure out who is who, how to think about things. People were real-time tweeting about the deals they were working on. And that was a big shift that I would have never before gone, how do I go learn about the industry? So Seattle has an active startup community, but it's a lot smaller than what you're going to get in Silicon Valley or New York. And so really getting to take those social media tools and go, okay, what can I learn? I did a lot of the Y Combinator materials off YouTube, right? So just really kind of doing that, how do you find the information you need? And even with our surgeons, we had surgeons who the OR got shut down. And so they were like, sure, I'll take a Zoom call tomorrow because I don't have patients, right? It's a lot harder to get a hold of them right now when everything's back to business. So I think just taking advantage of those opportunities when they come and recognizing what some of those limitations were, and then really going, okay, how do you get the access you need and the information you need at various stages along the way?
For us, I think, fundraising and people, especially when I reflect on the recent years, definitely a lot of challenges and kind of, product for us is just so challenging, especially not being a product. I think both more kind of product-oriented founders. For us, it's like, oh, we're just miniaturizing a 30-pound device. and a smaller device, and that shouldn't take long, and the engineers will figure it out and whatever, and starting to plan for everything else. And we trying to think the first kind of technical approach we took worked with two groups. One I kind of inherited, and then switched to another group for 2 years, year and a half, 2 years, and like weren't sure if this is going to work. Then ended up needing to work with two other groups, and it's just so I wish we would have been the same, double the cost, double the timelines. Like I wish that's what would have happened. And it's so tough because then you're behind timeline, you're over budget. You can't just like throw a bunch of money at it because you're already behind time and over budget. And so yeah, I think in the early years, yeah, what we hoped would unfold in a year, maybe year and a half, ended up taking 3.5, 4 years, and that was just a really rough first few years for us. So that's kind of my advice to folks, especially non-product oriented founders, is like do not underestimate the importance of good people and money, and like when you're developing your product, like that should be your core focus. Don't like, oh, that'll fall into place and doesn't need to be first and foremost priority all the time. And don't get ahead of your skis on planning for everything else. First things first.
Tim, can I ask you, when you were presenting yesterday, you guys have lasted a very long time and made tremendous progress with very little capital. How does that look differently, and what are some of the unique challenges with that kind of approach?
It's funny so Caitlin, thank you. I was going to say the same thing based on Kennedy's question, and first-time founder, and I'm sure many of us here are, the biggest challenge is having no complete idea of what the company would look like in a year or 2 years. So we launched in late 2016, early 2017, and planning a capital efficient business. We knew we were launching as a services business. It was going to be a complex sale, solution-led sale into hospitals. That was our hypothesis. Obviously, selling into hospitals is, now I know, incredibly challenging, and we don't do it. We had to figure out how to capitalize the business, and for us, wanting to build a complex VR-based product in a market that had very little funding, and I knew we were not a venture-backable business in 2016, and that the product, we weren't one of those high flyers who was like magically raising $1 billion. So we went after NSF funding. We were able to get NSF funding. When we actually received that first check, it was our 5th application. It took 2 years to land it, and COVID hit. So we were actually selling into senior caregiving facilities. They all shut down because of COVID. We couldn't get in there and actually conduct research. So we thankfully had some partnerships in kidney care who were willing to say, our patients really need something. We are desperate for solutions. We will be your research partners. So basically, in 2020, we were back to the drawing board and had to figure out, is this a business we want to continue to run? Do we think within our research objectives of 18 months, 24-month milestones, can we get to a place where we can productize something unknown, right? You have to wait till you're done with the research to find out if there's efficacy, if usability, feasibility with patients works. So all of that is to say, no, we've had to basically pivot 4 or 5 meaningful times, either market, product, team. I'd be curious from Adam's perspective. I receive so much inbound from customers, from people who we're talking to who are asking for job openings, and I wish we had the capital. I wish we had the progress to be able to hire them on the spot. So we keep track of all those people, and I think some of the mentors I've had have said, you want your first 10 people to replicate themselves 10 times, so you kind of imagine that 100-person company being kind of a duplicate of your first 10 hires. So I'd be curious your thoughts at some point. That's kind of how I think about a larger company right now. We're 14, 15. So thank you for the question, but it's very hard, right? We are only now at a point where I feel confident saying this is a venture-backable business, the market we're going after, the product understanding, it's applicable, it's adaptable to these 3 next markets based on the results we've seen driven by non-dilutive funding. So a very difficult strategy when you bootstrap and go after that sort of funding, but in the long term, I think we're better off.
I can, if you're curious, I can.
Yeah, tell us.
You're not gonna like. I mean, it's an obnoxious answer, which is it completely depends on the circumstances. Like, if what you need is just more horsepower and more scale, then yeah, that's probably what you want to do. If the needs of your business change as you go from 10 to 100 people, you probably don't want, 10 clones of each of your first 10 people. So it really depends. There's value in a ton of different skill sets, and there's, it's, the kind of like a player concept, like as long as you're willing to be broad enough about what your definition of that is and properly spec out what you need each person to do, then it probably should be more diverse and probably should be a broader set than that. So I don't know. I don't want to push back too firmly because I'm sure there are great opportunities for that. But I think, it's diversity and the most broad definition of that role kind of demands maybe something different. I guess I started with it depends and ended up actually with an opinion.
You did, but I appreciate it. So yeah, thanks for taking in now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think we heard a little bit about the importance of being flexible and how everything is changing. Nick, we were talking yesterday a little bit about your FDA clearance story and the resilience and the grit that went into that. I'd love for you to share that with everybody here.
Yeah, sure thing. And, I was trying to think of, okay, well, what is it that maybe differentiates first-time founders from second-time, third-time, fourth-time founders? And, for me, I said, okay, well, here's sort of an example I think of because it worked out for us. And it's the kind of thing that I probably did because I'm a first-time founder. And, you wear all the hats and you're kind of relentless to make sure it happens. So we're FDA cleared. We've had 2 FDA clearances in the CE mark of our product. But our first FDA clearance, we had gotten feedback from the FDA after our response letter. We had done some work, and they essentially came back, and it was, you got to redo this part of your test, and if you don't do it in 48 hours, we're not going to be able to clear your product. And, I'm a first-time founder. We have a great team of second, third-time founders on the team, and executives, 35-year experienced medical director, who wanted to respond very, very differently to the FDA than I wanted to, which was to just do the test and to get them precisely what they wanted. So we disagreed on it, but I made the final call. I ended up driving to the hospital, and it's like one of those stories of what your uncle tells you, when you're growing up. It was in a snowstorm. It was 2019. No, it was December of 2020. So snowstorm in Philadelphia. Driving on the highway, not a safe. If you've ever been to Philadelphia, I-95 is one of the worst highways in the country. So anyways, I'm driving there. I get there. I do this test. I didn't realize it would take me 14 hours to do it. So I'm sitting in this call room waiting for pulmonologists to come in. And it also happens to be COVID vaccine day. So they kept going in and out because if they had to get their vaccine, they'd go. So it was, chaos, right, in the hospital, especially pulmonary patients, COVID. So it was very chaotic. Long story short, we ended up doing the test, getting the data back to the FDA, and we got cleared. And it was the kind of thing that, I thought back to myself and said, is that a first-time founder, CEO decision? Would I have made the same decision if I just relied on, the 35-year executive on my team? And I think that's what helps when you're a first-time founder. You have a very clear vision for the product. And part of it is also just a willingness to listen, but also make your final decision. So yeah, that was sort of, I guess, a grit story of our first FDA clearance, which was pretty cool. So,
Yeah, I love that story.
What was his logic? I mean, why?
I think so. He's a pulmonologist. So he has 5 drugs that were approved on market. So I guess part of it was I know what I think I would do in this case, right? And if I was in their space, I think this is how I would respond. Yeah, and I just don't think.
So he wanted to make an argument for why,
With all
basically disagree with them rather than
with all
get the
due
data that
respect,
they
no, we're not going to redo the test. And to be honest, I was like, I know it's the right thing to do. It made for a better test. I was a former auditor for some time, so doing a test and sample sizes and audit, I was like, this is a no-brainer. This is easy.
Yeah, if you can do it in a day or two, then
Why wouldn't you do it?
yeah,
Right? Just
don't
makes
sleep
sense.
for 30 hours and you're done. That's great.
exactly. It was
Yeah,
easy.
that could have solved a lot
But
of our
somebody-
problems.
maybe
I would have
first
loved
time
it.
wanna
founder,
drive.
right?
Yeah,
Not
like
sleeping
no
for
big
30
deal at all.
hours.
Whatever.
He doesn't like driving, so it may have been even just as simple as that. So who knows? But, yeah.
Has anyone else found themselves in maybe not a snowstorm, but similar situation where you've had to push back on somebody who has that experience? Maybe they've had a major exit, maybe they've been in industry for 35 years, they have a different opinion, you have to share yours and lay down the law. Has that happened? And what have you learned from that encounter?
So two quick ones in my case. So when we first went out to raise pre-seed, I had spent hundreds of hours on all the clinical data and talking to all these people and doing all this stuff. And so I was like, okay, I know all this stuff. And I went in and basically was told, well, you've never done this before. How do we know you're going to be able to do it? Didn't want to write the checks, didn't want to do the things. And a lot of the arguments why this wasn't going to work, they didn't really understand the space. But that's my fault. Like, as a founder, ultimately, it's up to me to communicate that, right? And so we just said, okay, you know what? We're going to go build a prototype, because then we can put that in their hands. They can see what we're talking about. They can understand what that vision is. And so we were told, you can't go build a prototype on your own. And so we did. My co-founder hand soldered the boards, 3D printed the shells, wrote the code in Arduino. I was over there writing the business logic with the clinical indications. And we just put together something so then we could put it in people's hands. And then they got it. But it was kind of like, you can't go do that before you have any cash, but it was what we knew, okay, you're not getting it. I think similarly, we have some fantastic clinical advisors, and I am a real advocate of advisors are not just people to put on a slide. They're people who need to really be active in the company. So I actually have all of our advisory agreements. There's a number of hours a month you're committing to spend talking with the team and giving feedback and all that. And so sometimes those advisors, kind of like what you're saying with the pulmonary situation, they've been doing this 30 years, right? I mean, the product that we're replacing has been done the same way since 1927. That was the year we went from pocket watch to wristwatch. Like, a lot has changed since then. And so there are people who will say, no, that's not the way it's done. And sometimes you need to listen to those, because those are the clinicians who have the expertise. And sometimes you got to say, okay, hold on. What are you seeing in that data? And so one benchtop study we ran, we were able to demonstrate that what they thought was a physiological phenomenon in the brain was actually just artifact in the existing technology. And so they had been making all kinds of clinical decisions based on that. But it took us going, no, we think there's something here, but then also go do the work, go prove it out and come back and have those conversations. Whereas other advisors, I've gone, thank you for your input, okay, good. And you got to know when to argue and when to let it go, so.
I think these stories are particularly interesting because I think at some point, and I'm not sure exactly what that point is, the job of the founder CEO goes from being the person who's writing the Arduino code and 3D printing it and bootstrapping it and putting it all together, and obviously that's very early, and then there's a transition, but at some point it's none of your job, right?
Yep.
And your job is to set the vision, set the direction, and lean on advisors, like at some point, those advisors and those people with a tremendous amount of experience, they become your team. Yep. And they, they're your full-time team. Mm-hmm. And your job is to collect that experience, that knowledge, and that understanding, have a holistic view of what your company needs, and make those decisions, even when they're incredibly difficult at times. Sounds like maybe this one was relatively obvious to you, but sometimes they're not, and I'm sure we've all had those experiences. And it's to be honest, I don't even remember what the question was originally, but or where I was going with this. But I think that's kind of fundamentally becomes your job. And it is, yes, those people have 30 years of experience. Yes, they know much, much more than you about something. Yep. But that thing is not the whole picture of what your company needs from that decision.
So Adam, since you are a little further on the journey here, even just starting to do that on product, where now I'm having to step out a little more than I would have before in the day-to-day, where was an area that for you personally was the hardest to kind of make that transition from being hands-on to kind of setting the direction and letting the team run with it?
It's a fair question. I don't know that I'm further on the journey, to be honest. You guys have FDA clearance. We're not in the clinic yet. Okay. So I think it depends on how you slice it, but what was the hardest point. I mean, honestly, it's almost every key product decision that for me is, what is the line between aligning between like, nope, this does not fit our company's vision and our mission, and therefore that is, my place to step in and say something, or that's an engineering decision and it's not.
Thank you. I'd love to pivot just a little bit. Simple question, probably a lot of different ways this could go, a lot of different answers we could get. What's been the biggest surprise for you as a first-time CEO?
Timelines.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote my first business plan for this company in 2016, and it seemed very straightforward, build the product, get it FDA cleared, commercialize, do it in 2 years, or whatever we thought it would be. But timelines change, and it's an interesting challenge because while you want consistency, right? Everyone wants, here's the North Star, here's the plan, here's precisely how we're going to do things. Reality sets in, and product problems, technical issues, FDA, situations, team situations occur, and then fundraising happens, right? And then you're telling the fundraising timeline story for 6, 9, 12 months while also building the product and the team and still operating on the back end. And so kind of constantly having to update your story, but it's still almost the same goal every time. So it's interesting 5 or 6 years now later doing it, it's just a fascinating problem to have, is that you're like, oh, but the plan is the same as it was 6 years ago, and yet everything feels so different, and all the timelines keep changing, and life happens. So I think that's the interesting thing for me.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. For me, it was sales. So I'm still getting used to the fundraising side, and I resonate with everything you just said, Nick. But healthcare sales, I mean, as a founder, obviously you need to have that skill set, and founder-led sales are super important. We are enterprise focused. We started as a solutions business. Incredibly challenging to map stakeholders across organizations, to herd the cats, to get deals done, to figure out what the deals look like. We started as a value-based contracting play on top of a services contract for hospitals, which in theory was perfect. Obviously didn't pan out. So we realized that, yes, value-based care and where these macro indicators are working their way into the business models that affect our customers. Obviously, that's paramount to understand, but then where your product fits in commercially and to be able to tell that story impacts all the way up to fundraising. The reason we think now is the right time to scale has a lot to do with the traction we've seen commercially. And I expect that to continue, especially when we look at where we have similarities in the types of customers we can target who share the same pain point, and where the product we're building can have overlapping value across those clinical areas. So for me, it was absolutely learning the importance of sales in everything I do, whether it's customers internally with our own employees, talking to investors. That skill set has just only been further reinforced every single day as I realize I have a new area to double down on and learn.
I already spoke about product. So I think the other one I underestimated, I thought fundraising would be easier, or that I'd be better at it. I don't know. I was like, oh, this, kind of, my background was like commercial strategy and business development, and I'm like, this is my thing. Like, I'll be good at that. And yeah, it was just such a slog. And we're equipping the most common provider in the country to detect the most common cancer. So it's like, okay, like addressable market is huge and blah, blah. And yeah, it was such a slog for, actually the first convertible note was probably the easiest. The bigger subsequent rounds, yeah, I think because it was like, I was kind of the naive founder, like, oh, I think I was better at selling because I didn't know what I didn't know yet, right? It was like genuine naivete, right? I'm like, oh, we're gonna miniaturize this in a year, and COGS is gonna be $50. And like, I genuinely thought that. It wasn't like and then a year in, we're like, oh shit, actually, it's probably gonna be like $1,000, $2,000 cost of goods. And anyway, so yeah, I think for me that, and Now we're, pending FDA clearance. We submitted 4 studies to the FDA. It's like, okay, FDA breakthrough device, first product of its kind that's ever going to be approved. And so I told the board, I'm excited for the first time that fundraising should go smoothly. And they're like, yeah, the company's at a better place than it ever has been. But the macroeconomic environment, now you're trying to raise it at a higher valuation, like you should plan on it being as hard as the last couple rounds. And I was like, just can't win in this. So anyway, I'm again bracing for a rough next financing. What is it? Hoping for the best, planning for the worst, right?
I think part of, having had a product background, I was like, we know how to take products to market. We know product. We know the engineering. We know the FDA. Like, we know what to expect. I think I was a little surprised by how much the non-product part of building a startup. I thought that would mostly be once we get to sales and all of that being big, but in the very early stages, I was thinking product was going to be a larger part of it. I thought patent lawyers wrote patents. As an inventor.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah,
it really is.
Like, will you draft it? And then it's like, wait, what?
Yeah. So I was, I'm an inventor or co-inventor on all our patents. And so I thought I could just do a brain dump one time and then the lawyers would take it from there and let me know when it was issued. That is not the case if any of you are in the process of writing patents. But at the same time, going through that process, you learn so much more about what you care about, what's going on in the market. We actually, through the fundraising process, ended up innovating a lot more and have more of a pipeline than we had before. So I think just how each of these things come together, you really get to explore all the different areas. But yes, recognizing from the timeline standpoint, from the fundraising standpoint, just how much all these other pieces of building a company really can make the product timelines look very different.
I think my answer is probably holistically decision making. When you're working for a big company and you're 8 rungs down, it looks really obvious what the decision should be within your domain because your domain includes a lot less. And it looks really obvious why, other people are making foolish mistakes or making good decisions or whatever. And then when you're there and trying to make those decisions, you start to realize that there's often no right answer. Sometimes there's a bunch of excellent opportunities and you only have the bandwidth to choose one. Sometimes there's a bunch of really bad options and you have to figure out how you're going to run through the wall. And that's what caught me the most by surprise and where I was particularly naive when I'd say that was mostly before starting the company and pretty quickly realized that when you're actually in that seat and the decision is yours about whether you're going to ignore your 35-year clinical expert and do something that they disagree with, like that call is actually a lot harder to make than it sounds.
Thank you so much. This has really been incredible. I appreciate everybody's vulnerability. You've all shared a lot of challenges, a lot of opportunities. I'd love to end with a question about why you do what you do. We talk a lot about this at Greenlight. What drives you? What you're doing is not easy by any means. What motivates you to keep moving forward?
I mean, we just have to have better care for pulmonary patients. I am one. I see our product on patients. I see it being used by nurses and doctors. They love it. They know it's going to change the future. And, that's why you do what you do, right? You want to see a better future for patients and just humanity, which is so cliche. I almost hate saying it, but right, you've got to have that internal drive. Otherwise, all the stuff we've talked about, nobody wants to sign up for that.
It's crazy that simple human mistakes, human errors that surgeons make because they're human beings lead to patients getting hurt. It's absolutely crazy that we're in 2023 and that is still the case for every one of their major errors. And to expect them to not do that is insanity. It's I really believe that by doing what we're doing, we will be able to prevent those human errors from injuring the patient and allow surgeons to still make the errors because they are human. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
I have a number of personal friends of the family and family members who have been impacted in the neurospaces that we're going after, and that's a big part of it. A big part of it is also equitable access to care. If you are in one of the top 10 cities in the US and you have great insurance and you're within 30 minutes of that tertiary center, you can get a reasonably good level of care. But if you're most other places in the US, let alone most of the world, that access is very limited. And so that same patient who can make a decent recovery in that top center is likely going home with a life of brain damage, with a life of caregiving for their loved ones, with their entire world turned upside down because they couldn't get access to that care in that first 24 hours. And so for me, it's really not only the treatment of that patient today, but what does the hope for the next 30 years look like? Because that 30 years of living with brain damage, if we can do something about it this week to change it for those decades, then that's something worth doing.
I think for us, yeah, it's been so clear cut that, better detecting and triaging skin cancer, which over 99% of it is curable if detected early, and it's literally, you can see it. It's like on your skin. It's such a clear, all the stakeholders win, payers, providers, patients. And I think that, to the human error point, part of what has been so motivating over the 7 years for me is providers want it, right? There's no like turf war or like, oh, malpractice or we're gonna lose money, or it's like every PCP is like, yeah, I'm not great at derm. I don't consider myself being great at derm. A tool that from when I pick it up to when I get basically a likelihood of it being cancer would take 30 seconds. That'd be incredible. And it's just like there's no pushback or debate or like, oh, all this, weird stakeholder issues. It would just, it would benefit everyone, and kind of, the human error aspect, it's made a lot. They play way too conservative. They're referring 50 patients for every melanoma, or they're like, oh, they know it's rare, and like, no, it's fine, and then they're missing half a melanoma. So like, either way, we can just make a big improvement there, and it benefits everyone.
Yeah, I'll wrap up quickly here. I know we're out of time. To Adam's point, I ended up having 3 total back surgeries in the Navy, and 2 of them were avoidable because of errors. And all 3 required 6 months recovery. So it's just thinking about the opportunity, obviously patient-driven. I'm still a VA patient. I'm reminded every time I'm walking the VA, but the reactions of patients who get to understand finally their care for the first time with VR is the coolest impact in the world. And then having the chance to be reminded, because we have clinicians and patients on the team who are also personally affected, either as care partners, as family members, as patients in the system, it's the only fuel that I need, at least personally, and it just keeps us going. Obviously, we've been through a lot together, but and we have a long way to go. But it is the ultimate driver for us long term, that's for sure.
Thank you. These 5 are going to be around all week. So if you're a service provider, if you're an investor, if you can help them in some way on their journey, make sure you connect with them, get to chat with them, and let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.